One mountain. Changed everything. Spain had the silver. Spain had the armies. Spain had the world. And then it lost all of it. Not because enemies took it, not because of war, not because of drought or disease, but because of the very thing that made Spain the most powerful empire on earth. The silver itself destroyed it, and the mechanism that hollowed Spain from the inside is operating somewhere in the world right now. Welcome to Dominance Aura, where history does not just tell stories, it delivers warnings. Now, before we go any further, this channel would like to ask something, and please, take this seriously. Subscribe to Dominance Aura. Think of it like this. You know that wise elder in the family, the one above 50, the one who has seen things go wrong that younger people cannot even imagine? That elder never misses important news. Never. Because they know missing information has consequences. Be that elder. Hit subscribe. Do not let this kind of knowledge pass you by. And just one more thing before we begin. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching this from? The city, the country, the corner of the world you call home. The Dominance Aura community is global, and it would mean everything to see where today's audience is tuning in from. Now, let us go back to 1545. It began with a fire. On the freezing slopes of a mountain deep in the Andes, a young indigenous herder named Diego Hualpa lit a small fire to survive the night. By morning, something unusual had appeared in the ash beneath him. The heat had been intense enough to melt the rock itself. What ran out of that rock was silver. Within weeks, Spanish colonial authorities had claimed the mountain. Within months, miners were tearing into its core. Within a single decade, a city had risen at nearly 15,000 feet above sea level, a city that would grow larger than London, larger than Milan, larger than any settlement the Americas had ever produced. The Spanish named the mountain Cerro Rico, the Rich Mountain. Emperor Charles V looked at what it was producing and called it something else entirely. He called it the treasury of the world. He was not exaggerating. At its peak in the early 17th century, the city of Potosi held over 200,000 people. Merchants arrived from Genoa. Priests came from Castile. Administrators traveled from Madrid. African freedmen, indigenous laborers, Flemish traders, and Japanese sailors all walked the same narrow streets at altitude. Every language spoken in the known world could be heard somewhere inside that city. It was not just a mining operation. It was the economic capital of the entire planet. The mountain delivered. Between 1545 and 1810, Potosi contributed nearly 20% of all the silver ever extracted in human history. For most of the second half of the 16th century, it alone produced 60% of the world's silver supply. The coins minted from its ore, the famous piece of 8, became the first truly global currency. From the markets of Seville to the ports of Canton, merchants on every continent accepted Spanish silver as the final word in value. Spain's armies were undefeated. Its navy crossed 2 oceans. Its empire stretched across continents. And now, beneath one mountain in the Andes, it had discovered a supply of silver so vast that the word wealth had to be reconsidered entirely. The crown was euphoric. The church called it divine confirmation. The empire, already the most powerful in human history, now believed it had been chosen. But the mountain had another side. The labor that extracted all of that silver was not voluntary. Under the Mita system, a colonial adaptation of an ancient Inca labor draft, entire indigenous communities were legally required to send a portion of their men into the mines for fixed periods. What those men entered was a mercury amalgamation operation running at altitude in the 16th century. The tunnels were narrow, the air was poisoned, and the cold was unrelenting. An estimated 8 million people died in those mines across the colonial period. 8 million lives. To produce the treasure that would make Spain, and then break it. The mountain gave Spain everything it thought it needed. What it did not give Spain, what no mountain ever could, was the wisdom to understand what was coming next. Nobody told Spain it was dying. That was the problem. When a nation loses a war, it knows. When a plague arrives, it knows. When an enemy breaks through the walls, there is no confusion about what is happening. But when wealth itself becomes the weapon, the victim rarely feels the wound until the bleeding cannot be stopped. Spain never felt the wound. In 1556, just 11 years after Diego Hualpa's fire changed the world, a theologian at the University of Salamanca sat down and wrote something extraordinary. His name was Martín de Azpilicueta, known to his students simply as Dr. Navarus. He was not an economist. The word did not yet exist. But what he wrote that year was one of the most precise economic observations in human history. He wrote that prices in France were lower than prices in Spain because France had less money than Spain. He wrote that before the Indies flooded Spain with silver, labor and goods cost far less than they did now. He wrote that money is worth more where it is scarce and worth less where it is abundant. In 1556, A theologian had written the quantity theory of money. More silver in circulation meant higher prices, always, without exception. And it was not complicated, it was not theoretical, it was observable. Dr. Navarres had simply looked around him and written down what he saw. Nobody in power read it, or perhaps more accurately, nobody in power wanted to understand it. Because here is what was actually happening inside the Spanish economy while the galleon fleets were crossing the Atlantic loaded with silver. The coins were arriving in Spain first, before they reached France, before they reached England, before they reached the rest of Europe. Spanish workers received those coins first. Spanish merchants priced their goods first. Spanish wages climbed first. And so Spanish goods became expensive first. A bolt of cloth woven in Castile now cost more silver to produce than the same bolt woven in the Dutch provinces. Not because the Spanish weaver was less skilled, not because the Spanish loom was inferior, simply because the Spanish weaver lived in an economy flooded with silver and demanded more coins for his labor, because everything around him cost more coins. The Dutch weaver charged less, same cloth, same quality, lower price. Spanish merchants looked at this gap and made a perfectly rational decision. They stopped making cloth. Why manufacture when importing is cheaper? Why build ships when the Dutch build them better and cheaper? Why develop industry when the mountain pays for everything? The silver had made economic logic work against Spain, and Spain followed that logic directly into dependency. The wealth was not staying inside the empire. It was flowing straight through it, to pay for Dutch imports, to pay Genoese bankers their interest on loans the crown kept taking, to pay German merchants running the trade networks Spain had quietly abandoned. A French traveler passing through Spain in the early 17th century left behind a single sentence that has survived 400 years intact. He wrote that everything in Spain was expensive, except silver. Spain had become a conduit. The greatest treasure operation in human history was functioning as a pipeline, moving wealth from a mountain in the Andes directly into the hands of everyone except the Spanish. And while this was happening, the crown kept spending. Charles V borrowed against future silver shipments. Philip II inherited the debt and added to it, 4 times during his reign alone. The most powerful king on earth told his bankers the money was not coming. Not a renegotiation, not a delay, a default. The first was in 1557, the fourth was in 1596. By then he signed the paperwork without hesitation. It had become routine. Philip II died in 1598. Spain defaulted 6 more times in the 65 years after his death. 13 defaults in total between 1500 and 1900, the all-time record for any sovereign nation in history. All of it, while the silver was still coming out of the mountain. There were voices warning the crown. A group of Spanish writers and economic reformers called the arbitristas sent the throne detailed policy analyses. They warned about royal overspending. They warned about tax system failures. They warned about Spain's humiliating dependence on foreign merchants and foreign bankers. They laid out exactly what was happening and exactly what needed to change. The crown received every paper, acknowledged every argument, and did nothing. Because the mountain was still producing. Because there was always another loan to negotiate. Because the next fleet from Acapulco would solve the problem. Until it didn't. There's a particular kind of danger that does not arrive with noise. It does not announce itself. It does not break down doors. It does not come dressed as an enemy. It comes dressed as a trusted colleague, sitting at a familiar desk, doing a familiar job, with familiar hands. And by the time anyone notices, the damage is already done. By the early 17th century, something quiet and devastating had begun inside the most important building in Potosi. Not in the mines, not in the crown's treasury, not in the war rooms of Madrid. It began inside the Potosi Mint, the facility responsible for converting raw silver from Cerro Rico into the piece of 8, the coin that merchants from Boston to Beijing had accepted as the most trusted currency on earth for over a century. The mountain was slowing down. The richest veins had been worked through decades of extraction. Production that had once seemed limitless was visibly declining. The pressure on the royal treasury in Madrid was intensifying with every shipment that arrived lighter than the last. And inside the mint, that pressure was felt by the men whose legal responsibility was the most sacred in the entire monetary system. They were called the assayers. Their job was singular and non-negotiable. Every coin leaving the Potosi Mint had to contain exactly 93 parts silver per 100, as decreed by King Philip IV in 1642. The assayers certified this. Their stamp on a coin was a guarantee. Their signature was the word of the empire itself. And they lied. It did not begin dramatically. It rarely does. The first coins were only slightly below standard, enough silver removed to pocket a quiet profit, small enough that no merchant weighing the coin in his palm would immediately notice. The math was simple. Thousands of coins processed daily, each one shaved just slightly, the difference collected silently, and pocketed. But greed does not remain small. The assayers brought in partners. The partners brought in officials. The officials brought in their supervisors. The supervisors brought in administrators. The corruption spread through the mint the way water moves through cracked stone, slowly at first, then everywhere at once. By one historian's careful estimate, nearly every official within 1,000 miles of Potosi had been touched by the network. Even the viceroy of Peru himself fell under suspicion. For years, the world did not know. The coins looked identical. They carried the same stamp. They bore the same royal insignia. They arrived in the same leather pouches on the same galleon fleets. Merchants in Seville accepted them. Traders in Amsterdam counted them. Merchants in Canton weighed them against silk and spice. But by 1638, something had shifted. Experienced merchants, men who had handled thousands of coins across decades of trade, began to notice the weight was not quite right. The color was slightly off. The coins from Potosi, the coins the entire world had trusted without question for nearly a century, were no longer what they claimed to be. By the early 1640s, merchants from the American colonies to the trading ports of China were openly rejecting them. The piece of 8, the world's first global reserve currency, had become a coin that no serious merchant would accept at face value. The news traveled faster than any galleon fleet. Philip IV finally responded in 1648. He dispatched an investigator to Potosi, a former inquisitor named Francisco de Nestares Marin, a man trained not in finance, but in extracting truth from people who had built their lives around concealing it. He arrived at the end of that year. He did not take long. Within months, the entire network had been unraveled. The key figures were Francisco Gomez de la Rocha, a former mayor of Potosi, and Juan Ramirez de Arellano, the chief assayer, the man whose literal function had been to guarantee to the entire world that Spanish silver was exactly what it claimed to be. Both were executed by strangulation in December 1649. Over 100 additional individuals were punished across the network. Philip IV devalued the fraudulent coins by royal decree. An 8 real coin that had circulated at full value was now worth 6. He introduced a new coin design in 1652 with the assayer's name stamped in 3 separate locations, so that future fraud could be traced directly to its source. But the execution had already happened. Not of Gomez de la Rocha, not of Ramirez de Arellano. The execution of trust. The numismatic historian Jesse Kraft of the American Numismatic Society documented that the fraud directly reshaped the monetary history of the British North American colonies, forcing them to develop entirely alternative monetary systems because Spanish silver could no longer be relied upon. The most trusted coin in the world had been corrupted from the inside by the very people appointed to protect it. Philip IV could sign decrees. He could stamp new coins. He could strangle the men responsible in the public square of Potosi for all the world to witness. What he could not do was make the world forget what it had already learned. History does not remember the empires that fell. It remembers the ones who understood, before the fall came, exactly where to stand. Spain's collapse was not a sudden earthquake. It was not a single catastrophic moment that historians could point to and say, that was the day everything ended. It was something far more instructive. It was a slow and documented extraction. Wealth draining quietly, systematically, and permanently away from those who believed the system would protect them, toward those who had already decided not to rely on the system at all. And the forensic record of exactly who survived, and precisely why, is one of the most valuable strategic documents in economic history. The first group who preserved their wealth were the Genoese banking families. Names like Grimaldo, names like Spinola, these were not men who owned mines. They did not control mountains. They did not command armies or govern provinces. What they controlled was something far more valuable in the long run. They controlled the flow. The Spinola family alone participated in 98 separate loan contracts with the Spanish crown. They lent to Philip II. They absorbed losses during each default. They negotiated new terms. And then they lent again, because the interest rates were extraordinary. And because these families understood something Philip II never did. Whoever sits between the resource and the market extracts value from both sides. They were not holding silver. They were managing the movement of silver. And movement, unlike possession, cannot be defaulted on, cannot be devalued by decree, cannot be confiscated by a king who has run out of options. Today, the equivalent is not a Genoese banking house. It is anyone who controls distribution infrastructure rather than owning the underlying asset itself, the payment processor rather than the currency issuer, the logistics operator rather than the manufacturer, the platform rather than the product. Spain produced the silver. The Genoese collected the margin on every transaction silver passed through. The second group were the Calvinist craftsmen and merchants who fled Spanish-controlled territories during the Dutch Revolt. They left with nothing the Spanish crown considered valuable, No land grants, no royal monopolies, no silver-backed titles or inherited estates. They left with skills, with professional knowledge, with craft techniques refined across generations. When they reached Amsterdam and the northern provinces, they did not arrive as refugees in the conventional sense. They arrived as a portable economy. They built the Dutch Golden Age. They constructed the Dutch East India Company, the first publicly traded joint stock company in human history. They created the financial architecture that would replace Spain as the center of a world trade for the next 2 centuries. And every bit of that value had crossed borders inside their hands and inside their minds. The Spanish crown could confiscate land. It could seize goods. It could freeze accounts and revoke licenses. What it could not do was reach inside a master weaver's knowledge and remove what he knew about his craft. Today, the modern equivalent is portable human capital, specialized skills, professional networks built across industries and borders, credentials and expertise that function regardless of what any single government decides to do with its currency or its economy. The Calvinist weavers of Flanders understood this principle without ever having read a single line of economic theory. They simply moved and built something the most powerful empire on earth could not touch. The third group were landowners and producers operating in Spain's coastal periphery, those with genuine productive capacity that did not depend on the silver-funded imperial system to function. The regions that suffered most catastrophically during Spain's long decline were Castile and the interior, territories entirely dependent on what the crown distributed. The coastal regions, which could trade directly with foreign markets and maintained working agricultural and fishing economies, adapted. They had built productive systems that generated real value through mechanisms entirely separate from the monetary system's health. This is the same pattern the Roman forensic record confirms. The same pattern visible in every currency crisis across recorded history. The individual or the enterprise with productive capacity that functions regardless of what the currency does holds something fundamentally different from the person holding financial promises. The fourth and most critical lesson concerns the juros. These were royal debt instruments, essentially Spanish government bonds. When silver flooded the economy, the wealthy elite of Castile invested heavily in juros rather than in productive enterprise. The return was guaranteed by the crown itself. The logic was straightforward. Why build a factory when the king pays reliable interest? Why develop trade networks when the treasury covers everything? The crown defaulted 13 times. The juros holders were wiped out, repeatedly, systematically. They had chosen the king's promise over productive capacity, and when the promise failed, as promises backed by weakening institutions always eventually do, there was nothing left beneath it. The Genoese bankers controlled flow. The Calvinist craftsmen carried skill. The coastal producers maintained output. The juros holders held paper backed by a mountain that was running out of silver, and a crown that had already decided, more than once, that its promises had limits. The Spanish Empire did not fall in a single moment. It was hollowed out, coin by coin, default by default, policy paper by ignored policy paper, until the structure that had once called itself the treasury of the world had nothing left inside it worth trusting. The lesson Potosi left behind was not written by emperors or economists. It was written by the people who watched the silver flow past them, understood that possession was not the same as productivity, and built accordingly. The silver was never the wealth. It was only ever what you chose to build with it, and what you could build with it depended entirely on what you had already constructed before you needed it.